The crowd roared as the final opponent collapsed at Sarah's feet, his body broken, his spirit shattered. The grand arena of the celestial trials trembled with the force of countless voices screaming her name, chanting in a feverish chorus, "Sarus! Sarus! Sarus!" High Warlady Seris stood motionless in the center of the battleground, her twin warblades humming with residual energy. Her armor, adorned with the insignia of the Xi'an Dominion, bore the scars of a brutal fight, but she remained standing, unyielding, victorious. The trial was over. She had won again. Yet as she turned to face the towering council seated above the arena, she felt nothing. No thrill, no rush, no satisfaction. Victory had long become a dull inevitability. A Xi'an herald stepped forward, his mechanical wings unfolding with a sharp hiss. High Warlady Seris of the Althan Dominion, champion of the celestial trials, by right of conquest, you may now claim your grand prize. The great gates at the far end of the arena groaned open. Silence swept over the audience as the prize was revealed. A human. Sarus narrowed her eyes. Of all the rewards she had claimed in the past, planets, fleets, the submission of conquered rulers, this was something different. The man was escorted forward by 2 armored guards, his wrists bound in energy restraints. He had no Xi'an features, no bio-augmentation, no warrior's physique. Yet there was something about the way he carried himself, his spine straight, his chin lifted, that made him stand out among the defeated she had seen before. His dark eyes locked onto hers, sharp and defiant. He was not afraid. Sarus descended from the arena's central platform, her steps slow, deliberate. The air between them felt charged as she came to stand before him. "You are James Carter," she said, more a statement than a question. He didn't answer. He barely blinked. Sarus felt a flicker of irritation. "Speak, human. You stand before the High War Lady of the Dominion." A slow smirk tugged at the corner of his lips, and a ripple of shock passed through the crowd. Sarus saw her war council tense in their viewing chambers. Defiance from a prize was unheard of. But instead of rage, something else stirred within her. "Do you not understand your position?" she asked, voice low. "I understand perfectly," James replied. "You think you own me?" His eyes burned with something deeper than mere defiance. "But you don't." For the first time in years, Sarus found herself at a loss for words. The herald cleared his throat. "By the laws of the celestial trials, the grand prize is now in your possession. War. His fate is yours to decide." Sarus studied him. Every instinct told her to crush his spirit, to remind him that he was nothing but a trophy now. Yet she hesitated. She had seen fear, hatred, resignation in the eyes of those she conquered. But this was different. "Take him to my warship," she finally ordered. "I will decide his fate later." The crowd erupted once more, their chants shaking the arena, but Sarus barely heard them. As she turned and strode away, she could feel James Carter's gaze burning into her back. And for the first time in a long time, victory no longer felt so simple. James Carter sat on the edge of the sleek metallic cot, staring at the energy barrier that sealed his new prison. The room was larger than he expected, cold, sterile, and quiet. The walls were a deep obsidian, smooth as glass, reflecting the dim golden glow of alien technology embedded into the structure. This was no dungeon. It was a chamber designed for a prize, a trophy. He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders, testing the soreness in his muscles. His wrists were free now, but the restraints had left a dull ache behind. He had been through worse, much worse. A sound broke the silence, a sharp hiss as the chamber's entrance slid open. He didn't move, didn't stand. He knew who it was before he even turned his head. Sarus. She strode into the room like she owned it, like she owned him. The way she moved was effortless, predatory, each step filled with purpose. Her armour was gone, replaced by a form-fitting, high-collared black uniform adorned with the insignia of the Thean Dominion. She carried no weapons, yet James could feel the weight of her presence as if she did. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she tilted her head slightly. "You didn't kneel." James let out a dry chuckle. "Should I have?" "Most do." "Then maybe you need to meet better people." Her lips twitched, not quite a smile, but something close. She stepped closer, the energy barrier shimmering in response to her movement. "You are aware of what you are?" she asked, her voice calm, measured. James met her gaze, unflinching. "A prisoner." "A prize," she corrected. "You belong to me now." "Yeah? Try and make me act like it." The air between them grew heavier. Sarus didn't seem angry. If anything, she looked intrigued. He got the feeling this was only the beginning. Sensed that she wasn't used to being challenged, that people around her obeyed because they had no other choice. "You don't fear me," she observed. James exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Oh, I fear you," he admitted. "I just don't respect you." A flicker of something passed through her eyes, too fast to read. "You're bold," she said. "You're predictable." That got a reaction, the subtle tightening of her jaw, the barest narrowing of her eyes. "You assume you know me," she said. "I assume you think you own me." He leaned forward slightly. "And I assume that bothers you more than you expected it to." Sarus was silent for a long moment. Then, without another word, she deactivated the energy barrier with a flick of her fingers. The glow faded, leaving nothing but empty air between them. James tensed. Was this a test? A challenge? A trap? Sarus stepped closer, standing directly in front of him now. He could see the faint scars tracing the sharp angles of her face, the way her pale violet eyes studied him with something between curiosity and calculation. "You could try to escape," she murmured. James smirked. "And you could try to stop me." The silence stretched again. Then, to his surprise, she turned and walked away, the barrier reactivating the moment she crossed the threshold. She paused at the doorway, glancing back at him. "You intrigue me, human," she admitted. "Let's see how long that lasts." Then she was gone, leaving James alone in his cage, his mind racing with possibilities. And for the first time since he had been taken, he realized something dangerous. He intrigued her, and that meant he had power. The warship Obsidian Wrath cut through the void of space, its hull gleaming against the distant light of a dying star. Inside, deep within the command deck, High Warlady Seris stood before a vast viewport, arms crossed, gaze locked onto the endless black beyond. But she wasn't looking at the stars. She was thinking about him. James Carter, the human, the prize, the problem. He was nothing like she expected. She had taken countless trophies in her lifetime, planets, relics, even living beings of great rarity. All had submitted in the end. Some had done so immediately, others after resistance. But none had ever held her attention like this one. Sarus hated it. A warrior of her station, a ruler of her empire, did not waste time contemplating a single man, especially not a human, one of the most insignificant species in the known galaxy. And yet his defiance, his refusal to break, lingered in her mind. He was not afraid of her. He should be. A sharp chime interrupted her thoughts. The doors to the command chamber slid open, revealing Vag, her chief advisor, and one of the few beings in the Dominion with the right to address her without permission. His golden eyes, sharp and calculating, flickered with something unreadable. "You've made the council nervous," he said without preamble. Sarus didn't turn. "The council is always nervous. This time they have reason." Fadsi stepped closer, lowering his voice. "They question your judgment, your attachment to the human." Her shoulders stiffened. "I have no attachment. Then why is he still alive? Silence. Vadsi exhaled sharply. He is a liability, a weakness. The Dominion cannot afford weakness. Sarus turned then, slowly, her expression unreadable. Is that what they say? It is what they believe. He met her gaze without fear. They are watching Sarus closely. Sarus knew what that meant. The Dominion was not ruled by a single individual, despite what outsiders believed. It was an empire of conquest, where strength dictated power. If they sensed weakness in her, even the illusion of it, there would be consequences. She should have killed James Carter the moment he defied her. So why hadn't she? A deep voice cut through her thoughts. Are you always this popular, or am I special? Sarus turned sharply. James stood at the entrance of the chamber, flanked by 2 guards. He had been cleaned up since his arrival, his torn earth uniform replaced with simple black attire suited for prisoners of high value. But despite his captivity, he carried himself with the same infuriating confidence. Vatsi's expression darkened. You allow him to wander freely now? He is still confined to the warship, Sarus said coolly. Besides, I doubt he will try anything foolish. She turned her attention to James. Will you? He smirked. Define foolish. Sarus almost smiled. Almost. Vatsi's irritation was clear, but he said nothing more. He had delivered his warning. His presence was no longer necessary. With a sharp bow, he departed, leaving Sarus alone with James and the 2 guards. She studied him, arms still crossed. You're bold, human. People keep telling me that. He stepped closer, ignoring the tension from the guards at his flanks. Your friend didn't seem too happy to see me. He is not my friend. James shrugged. He's not wrong, though. I'm a problem for you. Sarah's eyes narrowed. You are a prize. A prize doesn't make people nervous. She hated how easily he saw through things. She turned away, looking back out at the void. You are a curiosity. Nothing more. James walked forward until he was at her side. He didn't look at her. Instead, he stared out at the stars, his expression unreadable. Do you believe that? He asked. Sarus hesitated. A sudden explosion shattered the silence. The warship trembled violently, alarms blaring across the command deck. Sarus was moving before James could react, barking orders into her wrist communicator. Report! A panicked voice crackled through the line. Warlady, we are under attack. Unknown ships emerging from subspace. Hostile signatures confirmed. Vadisi's warning came back to her like an echo. They are watching closely. This was no random attack. This was a test, a challenge, and Sarus had no choice but to prove she was still the strongest. Her grip tightened around the hilt of her energy blade as she turned toward James. Stay out of my way. Then she was gone, heading straight into battle. The obsidian Wrath shuddered violently as another impact rocked the hull, sending tremors through its core. Red emergency lights flared across the command deck, casting long shadows over the Zeon officers scrambling to their stations. Alarm klaxons screamed warnings in the harsh, guttural language of the Dominion. Sarus strode through the chaos with the cold precision of a warlord who had seen countless battles. This was no mere skirmish. The attackers were organized, their strikes calculated. Someone wanted her dead. She reached the central holotable, where a 3-dimensional projection of the battlefield flickered with shifting data. Multiple enemy ships, sleek and fast, danced around the obsidian Wrath, coordinating their assaults with military precision. Their origin codes had been masked, but Sarus knew exactly who they were. Vadisi appeared at her side, his expression dark. It's an assassination attempt. Sarus's jaw tightened. Of course it is. It must be from the inner dominion, Vads continued. Someone testing you, looking for weakness. His golden eyes flickered toward her. You know what they expect you to do? Sarus met his gaze and nodded. She did. The Dominion did not tolerate perceived frailty. If she did not crush this attack with overwhelming force, she would invite more challenges, stronger ones. This was the price of power. She turned sharply to her officers. Redirect all power to forward shields. Prepare boarding parties. We will not run. We will take their ships. The crew snapped to attention, relaying her orders through the command network. The Dominion did not fight defensively. They conquered. A small movement caught her attention. James Carter. He stood near the rear of the deck, flanked by 2 guards, watching everything with keen, unreadable eyes. Despite the chaos, despite being nothing more than a prisoner aboard an alien warship, he looked calm. Too calm. She stalked toward him. "You're watching me, human." James smirked slightly. "It's a lot more interesting than my cell." He glanced at the holotable, studying the enemy formations. "Let me guess, this isn't just a random attack." Seris folded her arms. "Why do you care?" "I don't," he admitted. "But if you die, what happens to me?" She tilted her head, amused despite herself. "You are assuming they wouldn't just kill you first." He let out a dry chuckle. "Wouldn't be the first time someone's tried." His eyes flickered back to the battle map. "But if I were you, I wouldn't worry about dying. I'd worry about who sent them." Seris's amusement faded. He was right, of course. This wasn't just about surviving an attack. It was about sending a message to whoever had orchestrated it. And the only way to do that was to destroy her enemy so completely that no one would dare try again. She turned to Vardok. "Prepare my war armor. I am leading the boarding strike personally." Vardas hesitated. "Seris, if you go yourself—" She cut him off with a glare. "I fight my own battles." Vardas bowed his head slightly. "As you command." James shifted beside her. "You're actually going out there?" She smirked. "Scared for me, human?" He laughed. "Not even a little." Then, after a beat, "Take me with you." The request caught her off guard. She stared at him, searching for sarcasm, but found none. "You wish to fight?" "I wish to not sit in a cage while my fate gets decided by aliens with laser swords." His gaze was steady. "Besides, I know how battles work. You might find that useful." Seris studied him for a long moment. He was unarmed, unfamiliar with Zeon weapons, and an unpredictable element. But something in her gut told her he was not a man who sat on the sidelines. And she was curious. "Fine," she said at last. "You want to prove you're more than just a prize? Then earn it." James grinned. "Now we're talking." Seris turned to her guards. "Get him battle armor." The guards hesitated. "You heard your warlady," Vadza barked, snapping them into motion. As James was escorted out, Seris turned back to the battle. The enemy ships continued their assault, but they had made a grave mistake. They had challenged her. And soon they would regret it. The enemy ship loomed ahead, its dark hull illuminated by the streaks of laser fire flashing through the void. Inside the obsidian Wrath's hangar bay, Seris stood among her warriors, encased in her war armor. The dark plates gleamed under the crimson battle lights, intricate engravings marking her rank as High Warlady of the Zeon Dominion. Her energy blade, a weapon feared across the stars, hung at her side, pulsing with power. Across from her, James adjusted the unfamiliar battle armor they had strapped onto him. It was lighter than he expected, built for speed rather than brute force. The deep black material, flexible yet durable, the helmet was clipped to his belt, and the small energy blade they had reluctantly given him hummed faintly in his hand. He turned it over, testing its weight. Not a gun. Not even close. But better than nothing. Seris watched him. "You've used a blade before." James gave a half smirk. "Not one that glows." "Try not to die," she said. "That's the plan." The boarding clamps locked onto the enemy ship, the force of impact rattling the deck beneath them. A loud hiss filled the air as the breech charges detonated, opening a gaping wound in the enemy hull. The moment the way was clear, Cyrus surged forward, her warriors following in a disciplined wave. James moved with them. The moment they crossed the threshold, the battle erupted. Blaster fire streaked through the narrow corridors, illuminating the metallic walls with bursts of red and blue energy. Cyrus moved like a force of nature, her blade a flash of light as she cut through the enemy ranks with brutal efficiency. Every movement was precise, every strike lethal. Her warriors carved a path forward, their war cries echoing through the ship. James ducked low as a shot whizzed past his ear, searing into the bulkhead behind him. He pivoted, using the narrow walls for cover, his mind shifting into the familiar rhythm of combat. He might not have been a soldier in the traditional sense, but survival had taught him how to fight. A Xian warrior beside him was struck in the chest, collapsing with a sharp gasp. Without thinking, James lunged forward, grabbing the fallen soldier's weapon, a sleek plasma rifle, and spun around, firing in a smooth, controlled burst. The shots hit home, dropping the attacker before they could react. Cyrus saw. For a moment, their eyes met across the battlefield, her gaze unreadable. Then she was gone again, slicing through another wave of enemies, her movements effortless, merciless. James didn't have time to think about it. Another enemy rushed him, a towering figure in heavy armor wielding a double-bladed staff. James barely had time to react before the weapon came down in a deadly arc. He dodged to the side, feeling the heat of the plasma edge graze his armor. With no time to aim the rifle, he dropped it, rolling forward and coming up inside his opponent's guard. With a sharp grunt, he drove his energy blade upward, right into the gap between the armor plates at the enemy's ribs. The warrior let out a strangled sound, eyes widening in shock before slumping to the ground. James exhaled sharply, yanking his blade free. He was still alive. The battle pushed deeper into the enemy ship, Cyrus and her warriors carving their way toward the command center. They moved like a storm, overwhelming the defenders with sheer ferocity. But as they neared the final chamber, the doors sealed shut, thick blast shields locking into place. A trap. Cyrus stopped, scanning the bulkheads. She tapped her communicator. "Vadsi, override their systems. Get me in." A burst of static. Then, "Warlady, I can't. Their systems are running on an isolated loop. You'll have to cut through manually." Cyrus clenched her jaw. It would take time. Too much time. James stepped forward, eyeing the controls. "Let me try." Cyrus frowned. "You think you can break their encryption?" "Probably not," he admitted. "But I might not have to." Without waiting for permission, he knelt before the panel, scanning the interface. Alien symbols flashed across the screen, unfamiliar, but not entirely indecipherable. He had spent years working with deep space technology, tinkering with systems far beyond human design. And if there was one universal constant, it was that no system was perfect. His fingers flew across the interface, bypassing security nodes, rerouting power feeds. He wasn't hacking in the traditional sense. He was brute forcing his way around the problem, forcing the ship to work against itself. Behind him, Cyrus and her warriors held position, weapons raised, waiting. Then a sharp beep. The locks disengaged. The doors hissed open. Cyrus raised a brow. "Impressive." James grinned. "You should see me with a wrench." The moment was short-lived. The command chamber was not empty. Inside, standing at the far end of the bridge, a lone figure awaited them. Clad in ornate battle armor, a long energy spear in hand, he radiated authority. His pale violet eyes locked onto Cyrus with quiet amusement. "Hi, Warlady," he said smoothly. "I was beginning to think you wouldn't make it this far." Cyrus stepped forward, blade in hand. "And I was beginning to wonder if you would have the spine to face me yourself, Kios." James could feel the tension in the air, the weight of something personal, something deeper than mere warfare. He glanced between them. "Friend of yours?" he asked dryly. Seris didn't take her eyes off Kios. Traitor! Kios chuckled, spinning his spear lazily. That depends on your definition. His gaze flickered to James. And this? Your pet human? James rolled his shoulders. I get that a lot. Kios smirked. How far you've fallen, Seris, taking prizes, keeping them close. His voice was mocking. The council was right to doubt you. Seris's grip on her blade tightened. They sent you to kill me. Kios inclined his head. They sent me to correct a mistake. Then he moved, faster than James could follow. Kios lunged. Seris met him head-on, their blades colliding in a shower of sparks. The force of the impact sent shockwaves through the chamber. The energy cracked between them. Warriors on both sides tensed, waiting for the inevitable signal to join the fray. James didn't wait. He grabbed a fallen rifle and fired. Kairos twisted, avoiding the shot at the last second, his spear lashing out in a brutal arc. James barely ducked in time, feeling the heat slice through the air above him. He rolled to the side, coming up with his energy blade in hand, ready to join the fight. Seris and Kairos circled each other, the air thick with tension. Let's end this, Seris growled. Kairos grinned. Gladly. And then the real battle began. The chamber trembled under the force of the battle. Seris and Kairos clashed in a violent whirlwind of speed and precision, their energy weapons igniting the air with every brutal strike. Sparks flew as Seris's blade locked against Kairos's spear, the force of their clash sending ripples through the metallic floor beneath them. James barely had time to process what was happening before enemy reinforcements stormed through the side corridors, weapons blazing. The Xian warriors at Seris's back surged forward to meet them, and the room erupted into all-out war. James ducked behind a fallen console as a barrage of plasma fire ripped through the air, searing hot against his skin, even from a distance. He rolled onto his feet, grabbing a discarded rifle and firing a controlled burst into the fray. The first shot hit an enemy soldier, sending them staggering backward. He adjusted his aim and took down another. It wasn't the first time he'd fought for his life, but this was something else. This wasn't a desperate struggle to survive on an alien world. This was war, orchestrated and ruthless. And in the center of it all, Seris fought like a living legend. She moved with terrifying grace, parrying Kairos's deadly spear with rapid strikes, her expression a mask of cold fury. Kairos, for all his arrogance, was more than a match. He was fast, faster than James thought possible, his spear a blur as he pressed forward. Kairos struck low, aiming for Seris's legs. She leapt back, pivoting mid-air and slashing downward. He twisted at the last second, the blade barely missing his throat. With a smirk, he lunged, catching her off guard and forcing her back against the central command console. "You've grown soft," Kairos taunted, pressing the attack. The great Warlady reduced to coddling a human. Seris's jaw clenched. She twisted to the side, catching his spear on the edge of her blade before delivering a brutal kick to his chest. Kairos staggered, but didn't fall. James saw the flicker in Seris's stance, hesitation, not in her skill, not in her strength, but in something deeper. She wasn't fighting just to win. She was fighting against everything Kairos represented, the Dominion's ruthless code, its unyielding traditions, the weight of its expectations. And Kairos knew it. "Look at you," he sneered. "You hesitate. You question." His eyes flickered to James. "You think they won't see it? The Council already doubts you. This only proves them right." Seris roared and struck with renewed fury, forcing him back. But Kairos was smiling. He had planted the seed of doubt, and he knew it. James didn't have time to worry about Seris's internal battle. More enemy soldiers poured in, and the Xian warriors were struggling to hold the line. He saw Vaj, Seris's second-in-command, fighting off 3 attackers at once, his armor scorched from multiple hits. James pushed forward, dodging blaster fire and closing the distance. He dropped his rifle, too slow in these tight quarters, and drew the energy blade at his hip. The first enemy turned just as James lunged, the blade slicing across his armour. The strike wasn't deep enough to kill, but it staggered him. James followed up with a brutal elbow to the throat, sending the soldier sprawling. The second enemy was quicker. She swung a compact plasma baton, aiming for James's ribs. He barely twisted out of the way, feeling the heat graze his armour. She came again, relentless. James caught her wrist, twisting hard. The baton dropped, and in the same motion he slammed his blade into her chest. She gasped, eyes wide, before crumpling. No time to think. Another enemy rushed him. James ducked, sidestepped, and drove his blade into their side. The body fell away, and he turned, breathing hard. Vadik was at his back now, bleeding from a gash on his forehead. He glanced at James, surprised. "You fight well, human," he admitted. James exhaled. "I do my best." Before they could regroup, Kairos disengaged from Sarus and leapt onto a raised platform, gripping a control lever. "You always were the strongest warrior, Sarus," he called down, voice filled with amusement. "But strength is not enough." He pulled the lever. The entire ship rumbled. Cyrus's eyes widened. No. A deep metallic groan filled the chamber as blast doors began sealing off the exits. The ship's engines roared to life, shifting course. A sickening realization hit James. Kairos was going to crash the entire ship. "Enjoy your victory," Kairos said, stepping back toward an emergency escape pod. "It will be your last." Sarus bolted toward him, but she was too late. The escape pod blasted away, disappearing into the void. James cursed. "Tell me there's another way off this thing." Sarus snarled. Vadzi, the Xian commander, was already at a control panel, trying to override the lockdown. "I can delay it," he gritted out, "but not for long." Sarus turned to James. "You wanted to fight. Now you run." James frowned. "Not without you." She hesitated. "You're wasting time," Vadzi growled. "Move!" Sarus grabbed James's wrist and yanked him toward the emergency corridors. Her warriors followed, fighting their way through the last of the enemy forces as the ship lurched violently. They sprinted through the narrowing hallways, alarms blaring in their ears. The escape bay was ahead. A final group of enemy soldiers blocked their path. No time to fight. Sarus threw a detonator behind her. The explosion ripped through the corridor. The shockwave sent James sprawling. He rolled onto his back, vision blurring. Sarus hauled him up, half carrying him into the launch bay. The last of her warriors piled in, hitting the controls. The pod sealed. A violent jolt, then silence. Through the viewport, they watched as the enemy ship, now on a collision course, plunged toward a nearby asteroid belt. The moment it hit, a fireball engulfed the void, debris scattering like shattered glass. It was over. Sarus slumped back against the wall, breathing hard. James sat beside her, chest heaving. "That," he panted, "was the dumbest thing I've ever done." Sarus turned her head slightly, looking at him with something unreadable in her gaze. Then, to his utter disbelief, she let out a low chuckle. "You live," she said. James laughed, exhausted. "Yeah, that's becoming a habit." Sarus looked away, her expression shifting as if realizing something she wasn't ready to admit. James saw it, the briefest flicker of uncertainty, of change. She had fought for the Dominion all her life, but for the first time she had fought for something else, and that terrified her more than any battle ever could. The escape pod drifted through the void, silent except for the hum of failing life support systems. The wreckage of the enemy warship burned in the distance, distant fireballs swallowed by the endless black of space. Inside the cramped pod, Sarus sat across from James, her expression unreadable. James studied her. The battle had taken its toll. Her armour was scorched, a deep gash ran along her side, and the fire in her golden eyes was dimmed, but not extinguished. He had seen her fight, seen her command, seen her kill without hesitation. And yet, for the first time, she looked uncertain. The silence between them stretched. Then James sighed. So, what now? Warlady Seris, hunched over the pod's failing controls, let out a frustrated growl. We're adrift. The Dominion flagship is still searching for us, but this pod won't hold much longer. James exhaled, leaning back. Great. We survive a warship explosion just to suffocate in a tin can. Love the irony. Seris ignored the comment, her gaze fixed on the viewport. Something beyond the wreckage held her attention. James followed her eyes and saw it. A Xi'an Dominion warship. Not the Obsidian Wrath, a different vessel. Sleeker, adorned with the sigils of the High Council. James frowned. That's not a rescue ship, is it? Seris clenched her jaw. No, it's a judgment ship. The word sent a cold weight through James's chest. He looked at her, realization settling in. They're here for you. Frick's voice was grim. Kairos failed, but the Council will not tolerate defiance, even from a war lady. Seris didn't respond. She just closed her eyes for a brief moment, then stood, straightening despite her injuries. James stared at her. You're not thinking of surrendering, are you? Her golden eyes met his, steady, unyielding. I am thinking of surviving. James shook his head. You know what they'll do to you. You defied them. You broke their traditions. His words caught. You changed. Seris didn't deny it. Before James could argue further, the pod shuddered as a tractor beam locked onto it. The pull was relentless, drawing them toward the looming warship. There was no escape now. Seris turned to her warriors. No one speaks for me, but me. Warlady Seris clenched his fists, but nodded. The others followed. James watched her carefully. And what about me? A flicker of something crossed her face, too fast to name. Then she turned away. Stay silent. The docking bay was cold, sterile. Xi'an enforcers lined the entrance, their weapons raised. At the center of the chamber, waiting with quiet authority, stood a figure in flowing obsidian robes, the High Adjudicator of the Dominion. His gaze settled on Seris as she stepped forward, unarmed, battered, but unbowed. James felt the weight of the moment pressing down like gravity. This wasn't a mere reprimand. This was judgment. High Warlady Seris of the Xan Dominion. The adjudicator's voice echoed through the chamber. You stand accused of violating the sacred tenets of our rule. You abandoned protocol, allied with an outsider, and risked the stability of our order. Seris met his gaze without flinching. I won the celestial trials. My choices were my own. The adjudicator's expression remained impassive. And yet, your actions have sown doubt within the council. You have grown soft. His eyes flicked to James. We see the corruption you have allowed into your heart. James felt a chill crawl up his spine. He wasn't naive. He knew what this was. They weren't just punishing Seris. They were going to make an example of her. Seris tilted her chin. You fear change. The adjudicator's gaze sharpened. We fear weakness. Silence. A single breath stretched into an eternity. Then the adjudicator lifted his hand. The enforcers moved as one, raising their weapons. James didn't think. He acted. He lunged forward, grabbing Seris's wrist and yanking her back as the first blast fired. She twisted in his grip, reacting on instinct, and together they hit the ground as plasma fire scorched the air above them. Warlady Seris and the others exploded into motion, engaging the enforcers with vicious precision. The chamber erupted into chaos. Seris sprang to her feet, reclaiming a fallen energy blade in one fluid motion. James grabbed a discarded blaster, keeping low as he fired at the approaching guards. Do you have a plan? James called over the din. Seris spun, cutting down an attacker in one brutal strike. Survive, James groaned. Yeah, I figured. They fought side by side, covering each other's blind spots, moving as though they had done this 100 times before. James didn't have Cyrus's speed, but he had something else: determination. He wasn't just fighting to live, he was fighting for her. Then, as quickly as it had started, it was over. The last enforcer fell. The chamber, littered with bodies, was silent. The adjudicator, wounded, glared at Cyrus. "You think you can defy the Dominion and walk away?" he rasped. Cyrus stood over him, her blade at his throat. But she didn't strike. Instead, she leaned in. "The Dominion is changing, whether you accept it or not." She turned away. James exhaled, lowering his weapon. Vadzi spoke quickly. "The Obsidian Wrath is within range. We can still escape." Cyrus nodded. Then, to James's surprise, she turned to him. "You're coming with us." James blinked. Wasn't planning on staying. A small, almost imperceptible smirk touched her lips before she turned away. As the Obsidian Wrath slipped into the safety of deep space, James stood beside Cyrus on the observation deck. The stars stretched endlessly before them, a vast unknown filled with infinite possibilities. "So," he said, leaning on the railing, "what happens now?" Cyrus didn't answer immediately. She was staring at the stars, at the future she had never imagined for herself. Finally, she turned to him. "We make our own fate." James studied her, the ruthless warlady who had become something else, something more. He nodded. "Sounds like a plan." And together they faced the stars, no longer captor and captive, no longer warlady and prize, just two souls bound by fate and the infinite universe ahead of them.